Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt tales that touch the soul and inspire the heart. Today, we bring you a story of resilience, vulnerability, and the transformative power of love. Follow the journey of Emily, a dedicated nurse, and Ethan, a self-made millionaire, as they navigate the challenges of healing both body and heart. Their paths cross in a hospital room, and what begins as a professional encounter soon blossoms into an unexpected connection that teaches them both profound lessons about trust, empathy, and the strength to start over. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. The bustling hospital corridors were filled with the familiar sounds of footsteps echoing against the sterile tile floors, the distant beeping of machines, and the soft murmur of nurses talking in hushed tones. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag, which felt heavier than ever, and made her way through the chaos of the morning shift. She had just started, but the weight of juggling a long workday and the responsibility of caring for her younger brother, Danny, was already weighing on her. It was a burden she carried quietly, one that had become a part of her, like a second skin. As she passed the nurse station, one of her colleagues, Rebecca, called out to her with a smile that was almost too smug for the situation. "You're on room 4002 today. Good luck with that one." Emily paused for a moment, brow furrowing. "What do you mean? Why would I need luck?" Rebecca shrugged, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "You'll see." Despite the apprehension gnawing at her, Emily headed toward room 4002. Her sensible shoes squeaked softly against the floor, a stark contrast to the hurried pace of the other nurses around her. As she entered the room, her eyes immediately landed on the patient sitting by the window. He was a man in his early 30s, perhaps even younger, with broad shoulders hunched over and a distant, bitter expression. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to soften the hardened lines of his face. He seemed to be staring out into the world, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the glass. There was an air of hostility surrounding him, a palpable wall that seemed to push everyone and everything away. "Good morning, Mr. Black," Emily said, her voice warm but professional. He didn't turn around. His voice, when it came, was cold and filled with sharp bitterness. "Don't bother. I don't need another nurse pretending to care." Caught off guard by the cutting tone, Emily blinked, her hand tightening on the clipboard she was holding. She took a steadying breath and took a step closer. "I'm not pretending. I'm here to help you. I'm your nurse for today." He let out a harsh laugh, finally turning to face her. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with a mixture of defiance and pain. "Is that supposed to mean something? You're just another face that comes and goes. Another person pretending to care." His words stung. Emily had dealt with difficult patients before, but something about James's demeanor hit her differently. She took another deep breath, her voice steady despite the frustration threatening to rise in her chest. "I understand you're frustrated, Mr. Black, but I'm here to do my job. Whether you cooperate or not is entirely up to you. But let me tell you this, your attitude won't make things any easier for either of us." For a moment, there was only silence. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Then, to her surprise, James leaned back in his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. "You're not like the others," he muttered almost to himself. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" He smirked faintly, but said nothing, turning his gaze back to the window. Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. What had made him so angry? So closed off? She resisted the urge to ask and instead focused on her job. "Let's start with the basics," she said, her voice professional again. "I need to check your vitals and review your medications." James didn't respond, but he didn't resist either. His silence, though filled with resentment, was a small victory in her eyes. As Emily worked, she stole glances at him. There was something about his appearance that struck her, his faint stubble, the tension in his posture. He was young, but his body carried the weight of someone who had experienced far too much for his years. "You don't have to talk to me," Emily said after a while, her tone softening just a touch. "But if you ever decide you want to, I'll listen." James didn't look at her. But the slight clenching of his jaw betrayed that her words had reached him in some way. When Emily finished her tasks, she stood up, grabbing her clipboard. "I'll be back in a few hours to check on you," she said, turning to leave. "Don't bother," he called out. "You won't last." Her heart skipped a beat. She paused in the doorway, glancing over her shoulder. "We'll see about that," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot of unease in her stomach. As she stepped out of the room, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that James was more than just a man who had lost his independence. He wasn't just fighting his physical condition. He was fighting the world, and himself. She had no idea what had brought him to this point. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to make it easy for anyone to reach him. Back in the staff lounge, Emily slumped into a chair, her thoughts still lingering on the exchange with James. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to push the morning's tension out of her mind. Around her, the other nurses were gossiping, sharing complaints about their shifts. When one of them called out to her, Emily forced a smile. "How's room 4002 treating you?" Emily's tired eyes narrowed slightly. "Challenging. That's putting it mildly." Another nurse chimed in, chuckling. "He's impossible. Refuses to let anyone get close. I'm surprised he hasn't scared you off yet." Emily straightened in her chair, her jaw tightening. She was used to being underestimated, her plain scrubs, her unpolished demeanor, and the faint accent from her working-class upbringing often made her the target of quiet mockery. But she wouldn't let their words affect her. "I can handle it," she said simply, rising from her seat. As she left the lounge, Emily thought about her family. Danny was counting on her to keep him in school, and her mother's mounting medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. Emily didn't have the luxury of quitting or slowing down. She had to work harder than everyone else, even if it meant dealing with difficult patients like James. Ethan sat by the window in his room, staring out at the bustling street below. The people outside, so free to move, to live their lives, were a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Before the accident, he had been everything he'd dreamed of. A self-made millionaire, ambitious, confident, and thriving. Now, he was confined to a wheelchair, his independence stripped away, his body a mere shadow of what it had once been. And yet, the hardest thing to bear was not the physical change, but the way people now looked at him. They didn't see Ethan the man, they saw only the wheelchair. The loss of his former self left him bitter, and he refused to let anyone in. He kept his identity a secret, hiding the fact that he was the CEO of Reed Ventures. The last thing he wanted was for people to treat him differently, to pity him, or worse, to try to gain favor with him simply because of his wealth. But when Emily walked into his room, something shifted. She didn't look at him like everyone else did. She saw beyond the bitterness and the walls he'd built, and that terrified him more than anything else. As the days passed, Emily continued her rounds with the same steady professionalism, checking in on Ethan without fail. Each time she entered his room, the tension in the air was palpable, but she refused to let it deter her. Ethan's resistance remained firm, his cold glares and curt replies becoming a familiar part of her daily routine. Yet, despite the walls he had built around himself, Emily began to sense that beneath his anger, there was something else, a deep well of loneliness and vulnerability. One afternoon, as Emily entered his room with his medications, she noticed something that caught her eye. There, on his bedside table, was a book, Principles of Investment Strategy. The title read in bold, gold lettering. Emily raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Light reading. I see," she commented with a small smile as she approached him. Ethan didn't immediately respond. His gaze was fixed on the book. But the faintest flicker of something, maybe embarrassment, maybe intrigue, flashed in his eyes. "Something like that," he muttered, closing the book with a snap. Emily, sensing an opportunity to connect, pressed on. "I didn't peg you as the type to be interested in investment strategies," she said casually, gathering his vitals and making small talk. Ethan smirked faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Emily couldn't ignore. "It's just a hobby," he said, his tone guarded. But Emily wasn't convinced. She crossed the room, tidying the tray table, and took a different approach. "Well," she said, her voice warm yet curious. "It's good to keep your mind active. A lot of patients I work with struggle to find purpose during recovery. It's nice to see you doing something for yourself." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but the shift in his expression was subtle. His guarded demeanor softened just a little, his eyes flicking toward her with a hint of gratitude, though he quickly masked it with his usual aloofness. "Yeah, well, it's not like I have much else to do," he muttered, but Emily could see it, the cracks in his armor, the quiet longing for connection that he was too afraid to acknowledge. As Emily continued her visits, their conversations grew more frequent. Though always measured, she learned that Ethan had a sharp wit, a deep understanding of finance, and a fierce determination to push past his limitations. But there was something he refused to discuss, the past that had shaped him into the man he was now. Every time Emily tried to ask about his life before the accident, he would skillfully change the subject, redirecting their conversations to something else. One day, however, as Emily was helping him with his physical therapy exercises, she noticed a stack of papers on his table. Curious, she picked one up, skimming over the first page. It was a detailed business plan, complete with market analysis and projections. "This is impressive," she said, raising her eyebrows. "Did you write this?" Ethan stiffened immediately, his expression hardening. He reached for the papers, but Emily held onto them for a moment longer. "Old project," he replied curtly, but Emily could tell it was more than that. This wasn't just an old project. It was something real, something personal. She wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "This looks like something straight out of a Harvard case study," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "Where did you learn to do this?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I used to work in finance," he admitted reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to open up. "Not like this." "Really?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "That explains a lot. You're not just reading those books. You've lived them." Ethan nodded, but his gaze remained distant. "Yeah, I built a company from the ground up. Reed Ventures. It was everything to me." His voice dropped, and Emily could hear the pain beneath the words. "But then the accident, it changed everything. One moment I was on top of the world. The next, I was in a hospital bed. Unable to move, unable to be the person I once was." Emily felt her heart tighten at his confession. She stepped closer, her voice softening. "That must have been incredibly hard." "It was," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "It still is." In that moment, Emily saw Ethan not as the angry, bitter man who pushed everyone away, but as a person broken by circumstances beyond his control. He wasn't just struggling with his physical condition, he was battling the world, and, more painfully, himself. Ethan looked up at her then, his expression vulnerable. "I didn't want anyone to see me like this. I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me. Or worse, try to use me." Emily's heart ached at his words. "I don't pity you, Ethan," she said firmly. "I respect you." For the first time in weeks, Ethan looked at her not with anger, but with something softer. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was fear, but there was something more, something real, there in his eyes. As Emily left his room that day, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something more than just professional distance between them. She didn't know what lay ahead. But one thing was clear. Ethan's walls were starting to crumble. And though he would resist it every step of the way, Emily was determined to help him rebuild, not just his body, but his belief in himself. The days that followed were filled with tension, but also small victories. Emily's patience with Ethan never wavered. Despite his constant attempts to keep her at arm's length, his sharp remarks and guarded demeanor became predictable. But Emily refused to let them dissuade her. She continued with her routine, checking his vitals, bringing him his medications, and offering small moments of conversation in between. Every time she entered his room, there was a new layer of the wall between them to navigate, yet she never gave up. One afternoon, as Emily entered his room with his usual tray of medication, she noticed a shift in the air. Ethan wasn't in his wheelchair as usual, but instead, he was standing in front of the window, his hands gripping the windowsill, looking out at the busy street below. The sight caught Emily off guard. There was something different about him today, something softer, less hardened. "Good afternoon, Mr. Black," Emily greeted, setting the tray down on the table beside him. Ethan didn't immediately turn around, but his voice was softer than usual. "What's the point of all this, Emily? The tests, the routines, the visits. It doesn't change anything." Emily paused for a moment, not sure how to respond. She had been asking herself the same question for days. What was the point of trying so hard when Ethan seemed so determined to push everyone away? But she knew something that he didn't. Healing wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about the willingness to confront pain, to let others in, to not give up when everything seemed hopeless. "I think the point is that you're still here," Emily said quietly, her voice firm but gentle. "You haven't given up yet. And that's something worth fighting for." Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Emily saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Perhaps confusion. Perhaps curiosity. He was so used to being isolated, to facing the world alone, that the idea of allowing someone in felt like a foreign concept. "I don't want to be a charity case," he muttered, turning away again, his hand tightening on the windowsill. Emily stepped closer, choosing her words carefully. "You're not a charity case. You're a person, Ethan, and you're allowed to need help, even if it's hard to admit it." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emily could feel the weight of his struggle, the internal war he was fighting against himself. He had once been a man with everything: confidence, wealth, independence, and now, he was forced to rebuild from scratch. But in that rebuilding, perhaps there was something far more important to learn. That healing wasn't just about what the body could do. It was about learning to accept vulnerability. To accept that needing others wasn't a weakness. After a long silence, Ethan exhaled sharply. "You really don't give up, do you?" Emily smiled faintly. "I guess I don't." She knew it was a challenge. That part of him wanted to shut her out, to retreat back into the world he'd built for himself. But she also knew that there was something in him, something strong, something worth saving, that wouldn't let him give up on her just yet. Slowly, the ice between them began to thaw. Over the next few days, their interactions shifted. Ethan began to share more, albeit reluctantly. He spoke in brief bursts about his past, about his business, and the dreams he had once built. The conversation never lingered on the personal for long, but the fact that he was willing to speak at all was a sign of progress. He began asking Emily more about her life, about her family, about her hopes, and her dreams. These small exchanges, though often fleeting, formed the foundation of something deeper. They were no longer two strangers passing in the halls of a hospital. They were two people who, despite the walls, were starting to reach out to each other. One afternoon, as Emily was reviewing his medical chart, Ethan looked at her from across the room, his eyes softer than they had ever been. "You know," he said, "I think you might be the first person in months who's actually seen me." Emily met his gaze, her heart giving a little flutter at the vulnerability in his eyes. "I see you, Ethan, not the wheelchair, not the CEO. I see the man behind it all." His lips quirked into a faint smile, a hint of something genuine breaking through. "That's more than most people do." And for the first time, Emily saw a glimmer of hope in him, a small spark of something that might, just might, grow into something more. But even as they began to open up to each other, there was still the question of his past. Why had Ethan been so afraid to reveal who he truly was? Why had he hidden his wealth, his status, the very things that had once defined him? Emily didn't have the answer yet. But as she looked at him, she realized one thing: his journey to healing was far from over. And no matter how many walls Ethan put up, she would be there, helping him tear them down. one layer at a time. Each day, Emily's hope grew stronger. She believed in him, not just as a patient, but as a man who had the strength to face his fears, to heal, and to start over. And maybe, just maybe, she could be a part of that healing. As the days passed, Ethan's transformation became more evident. He continued to work hard in physical therapy. His progress slow but steady. Each step, each small victory, was a testament to his resilience and determination. And through it all, Emily remained by his side, offering encouragement, patience, and a steady presence. Slowly, the walls he had so carefully built around himself began to crumble. One afternoon, after another successful therapy session, Ethan finally stood without assistance for the first time in months. He looked at Emily, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice softer than ever. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You did the work, Ethan. You're the one who found the strength." As they stood there, in the quiet hospital room, a sense of peace settled between them. Ethan wasn't just healing physically, he was learning to trust again, to let others in, and most importantly, to believe in himself. And Emily, too, had grown through this experience, learning the power of patience, empathy, and the transformative nature of love. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay before them. Ethan had rediscovered hope, and in doing so, he had found something even more precious, a future filled with possibility, love, and trust. As the story of their journey unfolded, it became clear that sometimes, the most profound healing happens not just in the body, but in the heart. They had both learned that resilience, forgiveness, and the willingness to love could heal even the deepest wounds. For more inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories, and stay tuned for more life-changing tales. Thank you for watching.